The volcanic day that erased Minoan Crete. What if the most sophisticated civilization in Bronze Age Europe was not conquered by an army, but swallowed by the sea itself, its palaces, its plumbing, its written language, all undone by a single mountain tearing itself apart? The Minoans were the dominant Bronze Age power across the Aegean for roughly 1,500 years. Based on Crete, they built sprawling palace complexes, ran long-distance trade networks, and developed one of the ancient world's earliest written scripts. Knossos had clay pipe drainage systems centuries before Rome. Minoan merchants traded copper, tin, and luxury goods across Egypt, the Levant, and mainland Greece. This was not a simple chiefdom. It was a networked, literate, administratively complex civilization. About 100 kilometers north of Crete sat the island of Thera, today called Santorini. It was a thriving Minoan outpost, home to a prosperous town called Akrotiri, decorated with vivid frescoes and tied into the same trade routes that made Crete wealthy. Around 1600 BCE, the volcano beneath Thera erupted with catastrophic force. Estimates put its energy at roughly 4 times the 1883 Krakatoa eruption, enough to collapse the entire central island and reshape the Aegean's geography in hours. The ash deposits on Santorini itself reach 7 meters thick in places. That's not a dusting, it's a burial. Akrotiri was sealed beneath volcanic pumice so completely that excavations begun in 1967 still uncover intact 2-story buildings. Here's where the story gets genuinely complicated. The exact date of the Thera eruption is still disputed. Radiocarbon dating of olive trees buried by the ash pushes the event towards 1600 BCE, while traditional archaeological chronology has long preferred a date closer to 1530 BCE, a 70-year gap that matters enormously. If the eruption happened around 1600 BCE, but Minoan palace culture collapsed around 1450 BCE, that's a gap of roughly 150 years. The volcano didn't simply flip a switch. Whatever it triggered slowly. And that changes everything about how we understand the collapse. The eruption's most immediate weapon was water. When the volcanic cone collapsed into the empty magma chamber, it displaced the sea above it, generating a massive tsunami. Waves estimated at tens of meters struck the northern coastline of Crete within minutes. Minoan civilization was a maritime civilization. Its power depended on harbors, shipyards, and coastal warehouses. Trade networks, agricultural surplus, and maritime infrastructure weren't independent systems. They were one system, and every node depended on every other. The tsunami didn't need to destroy Knossos inland. It only needed to destroy the ports. Beyond the tsunami, the eruption pumped enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide and ash into the upper atmosphere. Fallout across the eastern Mediterranean would have smothered crops for 1 or more growing seasons. A civilization dependent on agricultural surplus has no resilience when the harvest fails. Here's the misconception that has distorted this story for decades. The Thera eruption is often presented as the single cause of Minoan collapse, a volcanic kill switch. That framing is wrong. The eruption was a catastrophic shock, but civilizations rarely die from one blow. The Minoans survived for over a century after Thera erupted. Knossos itself wasn't destroyed by the tsunami. The Great Palace kept functioning after the eruption. Minoan culture persisted, adapted, and rebuilt. The civilization was wounded, not immediately dead, which raises the harder question: What finished it off around 1450 BCE? On the Greek mainland, a different civilization had been developing throughout this period, the Mycenaeans. Centered at fortified citadels like Mycenae and Thera, they were militaristic, hierarchical, and by the 15th century BCE, increasingly interested in what was happening on Crete. Around 1450 BCE, nearly every Minoan palace on Crete was destroyed, burned, abandoned, or violently dismantled. The one exception was Knossos, which survived and was then occupied. The most plausible interpretation: Mycenaean forces moved in and took control of the civilization already gutted by volcanic catastrophe. The clearest evidence of Mycenaean takeover is written in clay. The Minoans had their own undeciphered script called Linear A. After 1450 BCE, the administrative records at Knossos shift to Linear B, a completely different script encoding an early form of Greek, the language of the Mycenaeans. One more thread worth pulling. Some scholars have suggested the Thera eruption echoes in ancient texts, including possible connections to events described in Exodus. The ash cloud, the tsunami, the agricultural darkness. The timing is intriguing, but the evidence remains speculative, and responsible history requires saying so clearly. When the tsunami struck the northern Cretan coast, it didn't randomly damage the system. It hit the ports, the exact nodes through which copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, and grain from Egypt flowed. Destroying the ports was like severing the arteries of a body, with no redundant circulation. That 150-year gap between eruption and final collapse isn't a mystery. It's the signature of a slow-motion network failure. The system degraded, contracted, and grew increasingly unable to absorb additional shocks. By 1450 BCE, the Mycenaeans didn't conquer a civilization. They walked into a ruin in progress. The town of Akrotiri on Thera is the closest thing archaeologists have to a time capsule of the Minoan world. Sealed under meters of pumice, it preserved two-story houses, frescoes of blue monkeys and fleet-footed antelopes, and storage jars still containing food. A civilization frozen mid-sentence. But Akrotiri tells us something else. No human remains were found in the ruins. The residents evacuated before the final eruption. They read the warning signs, likely days of earthquakes and smaller eruptions, and they left. The town was preserved precisely because its people weren't in it when it ended. The Mycenaeans, who occupied Knossos after 1450 BCE, weren't blank-slate conquerors. They absorbed Minoan artistic conventions, religious practices, and administrative techniques. Linear B itself borrowed the visual structure of Linear A. The civilization that replaced the Minoans was, in substantial ways, built from Minoan parts. The Minoan collapse wasn't an isolated event. The entire Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was already under strain before Thera erupted. Hittite royal archives record repeated grain shortages and emergency shipments from Egypt as early as the 14th century BCE, and Egyptian diplomatic correspondence from Amarna shows palace economies struggling to maintain tribute flows. Thera was the first crack in a structure already stressed. The Minoan story has a modern face. In March 2011, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami knocked out a handful of Japanese semiconductor and auto parts plants. And within weeks, assembly lines from Detroit to Stuttgart halted for lack of components. One disrupted node cascaded through an entire global network, because efficiency had eliminated every backup route. Archaeology has limits. We don't know the exact sequence of events between 1600 and 1550 BCE. We can't read Linear A which means the Minoans' own account of what happened to them is locked in a script no living person can decipher. The people who lived through this left us no translation. The Mycenaeans who inherited the Minoan world didn't last forever either. By around 1180 BCE, the palace at Mycenae itself burned and was abandoned, part of the Late Bronze Age collapse that ended nearly every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean within a single generation. The inheritors of the rubble became rubble themselves. Stand on the rim of Santorini today, and the caldera itself is the evidence. That flooded bowl, roughly 12 kilometers across, is the collapsed roof of the magma chamber that emptied during the eruption. The island you're looking at is the remnant of a volcano that consumed itself from the inside. So, back to the question we opened with. Was the Minoan civilization swallowed by the sea? Partly yes. The tsunami struck the arteries of a maritime empire. But what the sea swallowed wasn't a civilization at its peak. It was a civilization that then spent a century slowly bleeding out before the Mycenaeans delivered the final blow. One detail that rarely makes the headlines: the Akrotiri evacuees took their metal with them. Archaeologists found almost no bronze tools, no gold jewelry, no silver vessels anywhere in the ruins. In a town otherwise frozen in time, the deliberate absence of portable wealth is its own kind of evidence. These weren't panicked refugees. They packed methodically, and they left. The Minoan collapse isn't a story about a volcano. It's a story about what happens when a civilization builds maximum efficiency into a system with no redundancy. And then the mountain reminds them that the world doesn't honor optimization. The ash is still there on Santorini, 7 meters of it. The ash layers at Santorini aren't uniform. Geologists have identified at least 3 distinct eruption pulses within the Thera event, each recorded as a separate band in the deposit. The mountain didn't explode once. It came apart in stages, each one worse than the last. Civilizations aren't killed by single events. They're worn down to the point where a single event is enough. That's what Thera did to the Minoans, and it's the oldest lesson in the archaeological record that we keep having to relearn. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more.